In my travel sketchbooks, I've been doing pen and wash sketches based on some of the places I've been to recently. And one area that I've been travelling to is the Forest of Dean in the UK. And there are all sorts of lovely villages in that area, and stretching over a little bit to the east we have of course the Cotswolds, and one lovely area that I've come across is Owlpen and Owlpen Manor. And this is a photograph of part of Owlpen Manor, or at least one of the cottages on that estate, which I thought was rather nice. I like the way that this lovely old architecture is sort of shrouded with the greenery around it and so forth. And in this particular photograph, you've got this lovely old road going up and twisting around to the left. There's a nice gate there, and some steps and so forth as well. So I did a pen and wash painting of this particular building, and this is it. I put it up on Facebook, and I got several comments back from people saying, well, look, is there any way you can show us how you did that? So that's what this video is going to be all about. You'll note that what I've done is I've cut some stuff out and also added bits and pieces as well. For a start off, I put a couple of people in, sort of more or less hand in hand, walking up the road towards the cottage. I've also not painted certain areas, which is part of my style. I've also used a fair amount of splatter and so forth as well, using my three favourite colours, white gouache, pyrrole red and cobalt teal blue. And again, for the actual painting of the building itself, I've not changed the colours, but I've emphasised some of them, made some of them a bit warmer, using especially the Daniel Smith colour, quinacridone gold, on some of the stonework there. Just to give you a nice little sort of vignette of this particular building. It is pen and wash, so what I'll do, I'll show you how I start off with the pen work, and take it from there. And then we can compare what I do with what I originally did. Normally what happens is if I do a good painting of a subject I've already done in a sketchbook, the sketchbook painting always comes out looking better, but we'll see how this one goes. Now I've already done the pencil sketch for the building itself, and roughed in where the some of the greenery is going to go, the path, gate and so on and so forth. What I haven't done is put in the couple of people walking up the road, so I'll do that now. Getting the shape and height and so forth of people is fairly easy. You can use things like the height of a door to give you a gauge over the height of a person, except that of course in some of these old buildings, because they were built maybe 200, 300, 400 years ago, the people themselves were shorter than they tend to be now. But also, of course, the height of the people you put in your paintings will vary depending on how close they are to the eye of the observer. Now, we're going to have these people here somewhere on the path, therefore they're going to be relatively larger than you would get going into that door, simply because of the perspective. So normally when I do this, I'm fairly sort of sketchy, so I'm just starting off with the head there. They're facing away from the viewer, which makes life a little bit easier. So I'll put an arm in there, and so that's the torso. There's a leg. The other leg coming down there, I'll stop it above the ground. That gives an indication that the person is walking, and then I'll put her partner in just here. and people, when they're walking together, tend to fall into step with each other unknowingly. So yeah, the same sort of feature there. So there's our two people, and I think they're roughly the right sort of size and so forth, so that's okay. And one is sort of talking to the other. I also use people, apart from giving a bit of a sense of movement and life about the painting, give a sense of proportion, and also to help take the eye in. In this case, what I'll do, as I've done on my original painting, I'll paint her with a red top, and that red will help take the eye of the viewer into the painting. Okay, so that's our basic sketch done. What I'm going to do now is some of the Inkwork. I'll get that started, and I'm using these Micron or Pigma Micron pens. I use a 0.1 and a 0.5. So I'll start off with the 0.1. I'll get this going, and then so the pencil work I've done already is a bit heavier than I would normally do, but I've done that so that it shows up on the video. As you can see, my strokes are very, very sketchy. If I go off the line or whatever else, I'm not over worried, to be honest with you. I love my paintings to be loose, sketchy, and not particularly accurate. But what I want to do, I'm not going to waste time by going through this on the video. I just want to show you the technique I use. It's a graphics technique called thick and thin line. So I'm using a 0.1 on that inking work so far, and of course these Pigma pens, they use archival ink so that it's permanent. It won't run when you put the watercolour wash on. But I just wanted to show you this thick and thin line technique, and it's a way of making shapes, solid shapes, stand out. And there's a rule, and the rule is quite simple. Any surface, like this wall here, which is bounded by only one corner that you can see, so this wall here is obviously bounded by another surface, the wall back there, but you can't see it. Any surface like that which is bounded by one corner, the corner itself, the line defining it, is thick. So this is another one here. There's a hidden surface behind that, so I'll put that in there. Now this line here, this corner here, because it's bounded by that surface and by that surface that you can see, remains thin. And this one here, the surface here on this edge, is thick because you can only see one surface. And we can do that over the rest of it as well, into windows, etc. Now, like anything else in art, these rules are there to be broken. So I don't follow that rule ad infinitum, because if you do, you end up just going around the outside of the whole thing, or most of it, and sort of blocking it in, which doesn't give a good artistic effect. So I use it judiciously where I want to emphasize certain places. Okay, so I'll complete that, and then we'll look at the final stage of ink work. So we now have most of the sketch inked. Just to point out one or two things, you can see where I've used some of the thicker pen lines. Perhaps I could do a little bit more thickening just here and there. I tend to only do the thick and thin line technique on objects which are closer to the eye. I haven't used it very much at all on this building in the background, because if you use thick lines on that, it'll bring it forward, and I don't want to do that. This is the main building here, the one in the foreground, just going underneath some of this this work here just to emphasize. And I don't apply the rule about surfaces and so forth completely. I use my own artistic judgment to get it right. I might use a little bit of thick pen as well on sort of stonework and greenery, undergrowth, closer to the eye. Roads, paths and so forth, in this sort of sketchy environment, to emphasize those and emphasize the way that they move, they are shaped. What I will also do perhaps sometimes is put in one or two more or less tram lines, rather like ruts, and that just, I find, emphasises the flatness. This is an old artistic trick. Sticking that one up there where it comes to the between the path and the road. That's fine. Now I'm going to use some fountain pen to finish off the inking work. I'll show you why I use that in a second. But before if you do use fountain pen, before you apply it, if you've got any pencil lines that you want to get rid of, then get rid of those now, because if you do it after you put the fountain pen on, the fountain pen will tend to smudge. Just to show you what I'm talking about, I like to use fountain pen ink which is non-waterproof, where I want shadow, not just shadows but just dirty marks and so on, get a bit of texture. So there's, I'm using a Lamy fountain pen there with Lamy ink, and just to show you how that works, if I use sort of brickish colour, so down the sides here, that's fine. So I've used ordinary Pigma pens for these top lines around the window. Which don't run because the Pigma ink is permanent. But the moment I start putting on watercolour close to the fountain pen line, you'll suddenly see it explodes and you get this lovely grey area, not quite exploding as much as I'd like. Oh, there we go, that's better. And you end up with a lovely grey shadow line, but you've got to be careful. If you overdo that, if you put too much fountain pen ink on, non-waterproof ink, then you can end up with a great grey smudge everywhere. I don't want that, so I'm very judicious about where I use it, and it's usually under eaves, under windows perhaps. So not putting too much on. That's enough, I think. Leave that at that. See how that goes. That's fine. Okay, so we finished with the ink. Might just, having said that, might just put a little bit of shadow work on with the ink as well. The light is going to be coming from the left hand side, so it's going to be the right hand side of the building which is in shadow, so sometimes I just drop some, just shade that in a little bit, and that can help the overall effect. The other thing I've forgotten to do is to just sketch in the window woodwork. Some of this will be gone over with a white pen later on. Okay, So we have now, said he, finished the ink work. Right. Now, to start on the painting, what I tend to do is to establish my figures first of all. So I shall paint them first, because it's so easy when you do figures. If you paint them last, then they tend to get lost in the painting, and I want to emphasize, I want to show, I want them to stand out and take the eye into the painting. So I usually do their hair first. If there's any flesh showing, I mix up a little bit of Naples yellow and Pyrrole red. Just drop that in there. When you do figures at this sort of distance and so forth, do not start going for any detail work at all. So no eyes, nose or anything like that at all. That's still wet, but if I now put in the colour for the gent, it'll run with the red of her coat, and it gives it that sort of slightly dynamic feel to the whole thing. It feels as though they're actually moving. Fine, good. I'm not going to do their trousers at the moment, or at all perhaps. So now I'm going to start work on the building. Start off with Naples yellow. And I'm very, very sketchy. Look, can you see how that's suddenly blown there? That's underneath that window where I put the fountain pen ink. It suddenly exploded, and that's lovely. I do enjoy that. Just as I'm sketchy with my pencil and my pen work, I'm sketchy also with my brushwork. Quick, get it on fast, no hanging about. Leave white, don't be afraid to leave white. That just gives you texture and so forth. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, just to emphasise that a little bit more. So I'm still using the Naples yellow. And now I'm going to go to quinacridone gold, which I love. Just drop that in at the same time. And this is a colour that really makes the brickwork zing and brings subjects forward. Don't want this to be too much, so a little bit there, that's fine. One thing I didn't say, on the original drawing, photograph, there wasn't a downpipe, a drain there at all. But I thought it needed it, so I put it in. As an artist, you can put whatever you want in. You don't have to do it exactly as it is in real life. This paper has got a bit of a tooth to it, which I love. So you can see, dragging the brush across, it's giving me a bit of a texture there, which is lovely. I'm using bright sienna at the moment, which I enjoy. I often drop in a little bit of ultramarine blue towards the bottom of tiled roofs, just to darken it up there, darken up there. Always going for texture. Now the light's coming from the left hand side, so this side of the building. I'll start off with, oh, can you see how that's exploded? Lovely, gorgeous, love it. And if you do it quickly and you don't get worried about it, it really does, I think. Look, look at that lovely, lovely bleed there, I think is wonderful. So sketchy. So having put that on top of that, I'll use some burnt umber. Got this sort of corner brickwork here, so I'll just emphasize that a little bit. And the roof's facing away from the light. I'll just put those straight in with burnt umber. That's fine. Go for a brown door, I think. Drag that down. Leave a bit of light sparkling on it. Okay. All the time using dark and light to get my three-dimensional feel. Good. Just emphasize the shadow side of the building there. Always, when you're doing this sort of thing, any painting really, I always go for contrast, tonal contrast. It makes things look much more three-dimensional, much more interesting. I haven't put any shadows in at the present moment, just put a little bit of colour on that stonework just there. I don't want that to be too white. That's fine, okay. Now I'm going to tackle the building, or part of the building, which is behind this block here. Now there's always a problem when you do a building or something like that which is behind something else. For instance, a church tower that is behind the main church building, or whatever, and it's very easy to make that tower or the buildings behind tonally the same value as the buildings in the front. And in doing so, it looks as though the building behind is standing on top of, or coming too far forward, of the main foreground building. And the only way to stop that, or one way to stop it, is to just simply use the same colours, because it's the same brickwork, but tonally lower in value, so not as deep in colour as the buildings or the object or whatever it is in the front. So and by doing that you get this, what your painting takes on a more three-dimensional look to it. So you can see there that the roofs I'm putting in, they're not as deep in tone as the buildings in the foreground. Good. Okay. See, sort of Tudor type triangular or quadral four-sided chimneys that you often get in the Cotswolds. So we're getting there. These steps, I'm just painting. I'm not going to paint the top of the step, just paint the front. That's all that's required there. Now I'd normally go on now to do some of the greenery work, but I just want to show you how I continue with the buildings. The windows, I'm using Payne's Green. Again, just dragging it down, leaving it sort of, leaving bits of glint. Bits of sparkle where the light is bouncing off. That's a little bit too dark for those windows there. As I said, that building is in the background, so just want to take some of that tone out. That's better. Fine. Okay. And we want the building to look nice and three-dimensional, so we'll put in some shadow. Light's coming from the left-hand side, as I say. I mix the shadow up from quinacridone violet, which is a Daniel Smith colour, plus burnt umber, plus sometimes a little bit of cobalt blue to grey it down. And we want some of that under the eaves. Light's coming from the left hand side, so there'll be a shadow just there. Shadow underneath that overhang. Shadow. Shadow. A little bit of shadow up here, not too much. Just soften some of those edges. So that's a just put a bit more tone on that. That's the buildings more or less done. I'll come back to those later on with some more ink work, perhaps. That's okay. Now we can look at the greenery. Now there's a lot of greenery around it, trees, bushes, hedges and so forth. I don't want to overdo that, because if you do that and make that too dark, you'll end up with the buildings disappearing. So I'm going to start on some of the background greenery. I want to really de-emphasize this, so I'm going to go for a little bit of yellow ochre, first of all, very wet. Just up here, dabbing that on, nice and wet. A little bit over here. Now, the way I do this changes depending on what the subject is. Sometimes I do use dark greenery, high tone greenery, to give shape to light roofs and that sort of thing. But here I don't want to do that. So I'm just putting in this very, very light yellow ochre around. It's just to basically give it a little sort of framework, really. And then what I'll do is I'll use some of my green. Now, I've mentioned this green before. It's Green Appetit Genuine, so Daniel Smith colour. It's the only green really that I tend to use directly from the tube. It's not an over bright green, and it mixes extremely well with other colours, especially the reds and so forth, when you want to dull it down. But your usual sap green, hooker's green and so forth, I find much too rich, dark, and they tend to take the painting over unless you dull them right the way down with some form of red. It could be burnt sienna, burnt umber, or whatever. So that's quite a light foliage, the back of the house. Coming forward into the middle ground, I'm going to just bring the tone up a little bit, step or two, and to do that, rather than using yellow ochre, I'm using fairly wet lemon yellow. as my base coat, if you like. So I use a little bit less water in my green. So this is the middle ground greenery. There we go. And once again, you'll see I'm leaving a fair amount of white in places. I'll use more of the green, but I'll add a little bit of burnt umber to it to darken it, dull it down a little bit as we come further forward. You're working very much wet into wet. I'll come back to that in a minute. Quite like the way that's going there, so I'm not going to do much more to that. It's looking all right. Good. And then as we come into the foreground, we're now level and slightly in front of the main building there, so we want more tone, deeper tone, darker tone, more value. Tend to leave a fair amount of white at the top of foliage and so on, to emphasize the light on the top of the leaves and so forth. Just dropping the green in now, just letting that mingle, do its own thing. Don't force it too much. Use as few brush strokes as you can. And because this greenery is in the foreground, you can see it's slightly brighter than the greenery in the background. So we're getting that tonal perspective that's so important. Using a few flicky marks now. And I'm going to leave quite a bit of white, especially around the people. If you bring the tone of your greenery or whatever is surrounding your people right up beside it too much, people will be de-emphasized. They'll tend to disappear into the whatever's behind them, and they'll lose their emphasis within the painting. So doing a bit positive, negative there. So we've got these sort of rush type shapes. So that needs a little bit more tone there. Yeah, that's great. Fine. Working wet into wet. Okay, I'm going to leave a lot of this, as in my original painting, leave a lot of this white, just leaving the ink lines. I might go back and do some more of the ink lines later on. I'm going to do this brick wall here now, using yellow ochre, quite rich. It's always good to use a limited palette, so that the yellow ochre here on the wall is talking to the yellow ochre that was used up here. I might have to go back to that. So I'm going to do some of the work now on the road and the pathway. So often I find that when a road or a path or whatever is grey, I'll just have to use that same grey, and you end up with this horrible, dark, lifeless lump down in the foreground. That can be right, that can work well at times, but very often it doesn't. And so I tend to, my pathways and that sort of thing, even when I know that they're made out of tarmac, I very often go in with a very, very light colour. In this case I'm using Naples yellow. And just going to bring it around. I'm leaving bits of white here and there and so on. I want some texture. And I'm using brush strokes which are in the same direction as the road itself. It's a bit like putting hair onto a portrait. Your brush strokes should be usually in the same direction. And I'm going to dirty that up a little bit with colour I used for my shadows, which is a bit of violet, a bit of burnt umber. But don't do too much on it, otherwise on the road or the path, otherwise it'll take the eye away from the main subject, which you don't want. Just warm it up a little bit with burnt umber. That's fine. I'll darken that edge in a minute as well, and then we'll look at this. I'm trying to connect all the shapes together. So we've got the people, got the houses, got the trees and so forth, and I'm going to leave a fair amount of white here because it's just not necessary to paint that. So this wall here though needs colour on it, because that will connect the road and pathway to the people, and the people will then be connected to the house and so forth. So always a good idea to connect shapes. And going back to the people again, it's important to do that with people too. If you have separate people, which is what a lot of artists tend to do when they're initially doing them, it doesn't help the painting at all. It just doesn't look natural. When people are seen in the middle distance, they merge together and form an overall shape. So connect your shapes together. Really important lesson. Don't have separate shapes. Looking alright. Bit of burnt umber, I think. Burnt umber is a lovely colour. It's got a lot of red in it, so it's nice and warm. Tonally nice and dark, which means there you go. It can be used in the foreground quite nicely. A little bit more over here. Remember that where you've got corners, where you've got a wall coming down, you've got a flat surface, a pathway or whatever, or a road, it's always a dirty corner to paint there. And you want your houses, your fences, whatever, to look as though they're actually in the painting, sitting there, and therefore putting a bit of dark right in that corner is quite important. If the dark is in the background, don't use a dark blue or whatever, just use burnt umber to do that. Okay, we're getting very close now to being finished. I'm fairly happy with the paintwork now. Often see on forums, Facebook and so forth, people asking the question, do you put the ink on first then paint, or do you paint first then put the ink on? There are no rules about that. I've seen professional artists do it both ways, and it can give slightly different feels to the paintings. It's entirely down to your own way of working, and you just got to experiment to develop that. What I will do now, having sort of done the ink work, done the painting, is just go back in again with a pen and emphasize one or two areas that I think need a bit more work. And you'll note that having used the initial photograph to give me my shapes and so forth, I then discarded that so that as I went along, I chose basically my own colours and so forth. And in doing that, what I've done is I'm just putting texture on now, brickwork and so forth, marks, which I have no idea. I don't think they're in the photograph at all, but that doesn't matter. It's just making the thing look a bit more realistic, perhaps a bit more sketchy by putting these marks in. So you mustn't slavishly follow the photograph you're working on. What I also use, and I'll just show you in a second, I don't like using masking fluid. Masking fluid, I occasionally use it. I use it mainly for when I'm splattering before I start a painting, but I don't like using it because I find it difficult to get off. It can take the surface off the paper and so forth. And also I never ever get it on in the right place. I've seen experts use it and they get it exactly right every time. But try as I might, I just can't do it. I can never get fine enough anyway. So what I do tend to end up doing, just as I've used the ink pen there, I sometimes use these Uni Posca white pens. This is with a fine nib, and I just use that, for instance, sometimes on the window work, the white work on the windows. I put it on, let it dry, it doesn't take very long, and then go back over again with ink, or put the ink just slightly to one side of it, and it seems to work quite well. So that's me putting the ink back on again, just slightly to the side of the white line, just to get the dark in, and you end up with some lovely marks within the windows themselves. And you don't put everything in, you just put in a few marks here and there, and that's all that's required. Good. Now the final thing for me to do is to add some splatter. It's up to you. You don't have to do this at all if you don't want to. So, important points when you splatter. Number one, cover yourself. I've seen ladies on art evening doing splatter whilst wearing cashmere sweaters and so on, and not a good idea. So cover yourself with an apron of some sort. Also cover any bits of the painting or other objects that you don't want to be touched by the splatter. You can see where my table has had a few heavy hits. I use an old brush where the end has been sort of squared off, that's lost its point. This is a size 4 Da Vinci Maestro, and put it in some water, dip it into the tube, and then just gently tap. And I find sometimes I just leave it at the white and leave it at that, and it just gives that feeling of movement and so on. Where you get too much of it, you can always just take it off with a tissue. So for instance, just there I think I've got a big blob take that off. And it helps to unify the painting at the same time, I find, but it's up to you. Some people don't do it at all, and that's perfectly okay. If anything, I have a tendency to do it too much. But I feel now at the moment that's just giving me a bit of texture there, a bit of sparkle. That's fine. So I then go for my Pyrrole red. This is a bit of Turner. Turner used to use red, and lots of artists do. Just take the eye in, and it just lifts the painting very often. Not too much of it, and fairly small splatters. Fine. And then I finish off my third colour usually is cobalt teal blue. That's the painting finished. Just remember one or two things that I've said. Putting people into a painting, if you don't do it, do practice putting them in. Remember that a lot of the paintings that we do, churches, street scenes, whatever else, it's part of the built environment, it's part of the environment that we've actually created for ourselves. And therefore if you don't put people into paintings, I see so many paintings where it's completely devoid of any human life at all, and that always strikes me as being strange. But the reason for that is that people very often are very good at doing buildings, etc., quite confident, but they're not confident about putting people in, and whenever they try and put people in, they feel it messes up the painting. So do what I did, grab yourself a small sketchbook and keep on practicing simplifying people. Look at proportions, look at the sizes of heads against torsos, against legs, etc. Look at the sort of work of people like Owlpen, Crawshaw, Charles Slugger and so forth, how they simplify people. But you know what they are, you know that they are people, you know that they are there to give some movement, some reality to the scene. So don't be afraid of putting people in. Just practice it before you do so. Perspective extremely important, especially on paintings like this with buildings. And you can get perspective obviously by shape, but also by tone. So my ink lines for this building at the back are lighter than and thinner than those for the building in the foreground. Likewise, the colour tones too are lighter than those for the building in the foreground. So that's another important point. And do not be afraid of leaving white. I wished I'd left a bit more white around here perhaps, but you know, you can see that perhaps when I finish the painting, but don't be worried about leaving bits and pieces and leaving bits unpainted. Just connect the main elements of your painting together. Don't have too many gaps in between, or any gaps at all, and that allows the eye to flow through. So I've enjoyed doing that. I hope you've enjoyed watching. I hope you've picked up one or two tips, and I'll just finish by saying keep it sketchy. Thank you for watching.